Welcome to the 19th Peep Show mini episode of Barenaked Bravery. My name is Emily Ann Peterson, and I am the host of the show. And today we're going to be talking about the 7 steps, well, actually 8 steps to setting really difficult boundaries. This is something that you have to do as an artist. You have to do this as a human. You have to do this as a business owner. You have to do this as a friend or a family member. There are so many ways that these 8 steps are going to be really helpful for you. I said 7 in the episode title, but there's really 8. There's like a bonus step, which we'll get into it in a second. So, but before we get into all of that, I want to just tell you that there are so many cool things that are happening in the Barenaked Bravery community. We've got somebody posted in the Facebook group yesterday how she did something really, really brave. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but she posted a video of herself kind of explaining why it was so brave and how it went, and it went successfully. It doesn't always go successfully when we do brave things, but in her case, it went really successfully, and I just want to give a shout out to her. She knows who she is, and just say how wonderful it is that we have a safe place within the Barenaked Bravery community to share those moments of, oh my gosh, I did something brave, even if it's something is really, really small for maybe somebody else. It's really important to celebrate those small wins, because the small wins, when they are celebrated, makes the big failures that sometimes happen, it makes those big failures not feel so awful. So because we have a whole bed of small wins to lean back on. So, yes, big, huge shout outs to the Barenaked Bravery Facebook community. If you're not part of the Facebook group yet, you can go ahead and do that. Just open up Facebook and search Barenaked Bravery. You'll be prompted with 2 questions because I made the group closed, and because we were getting a lot of weirdos who are in a lot of questionable Facebook groups, so I have to do kind of a vetting process. So there'll be 2 questions that you get to answer before I will allow you to join the group, because I do value the fact that our Facebook group is a really safe place for our community and our listeners. I think it's really great that we have it, and I want to make sure that it stays sacred and safe and warm and welcoming. So let's jump into it. So here's some issues that have come up for me personally when I have needed to set boundaries, or when I've realized that a boundary has been crossed that I was unaware of to begin with. In my music teaching career, when I was teaching full-time cello students, sometimes I'd get these like helicopter parents who were just really hovercrafts over their children, and that put a really big damper on the lesson experience for the child. So I would have to, as the teacher, hold boundaries, kind of like I do with the Facebook group, hold boundaries within the lesson to make sure that the lesson space stayed safe, stayed nurturing, and stayed warm for the child to learn, right? With adult students or with marketing clients, I've had to set boundaries about payments and when they show up to their appointments, and when they have to call in sick for an appointment. I had to set in place policies, and then I had to enforce policies, and that enforcing of the policy is sometimes harder than setting the policy to begin with, because usually it implies that somebody has crossed the boundaries somehow. So, and personally, I've experienced this with family members who are either too nosy or don't have personal boundaries of themselves, of their own. I've had to set boundaries with friendships that maybe aren't edifying in any way, or they're not edifying in a certain way, and so I have to hold a personal boundary to either not talk about that subject with that person, because it doesn't do either of us any favors. So boundary setting and boundary holding shows up all over our lives. And I want to just share with you my 7 steps that I use to make this happen. So the first step out of 7 is finding your no. So I have learned over time, especially as a business owner, that there's like sometimes an icky feeling that ends up happening at the end of an appointment or a meeting with someone. And if I don't ask myself, why am I feeling so angry, or why am I feeling so yucky, or why am I feeling so fill in the blank? If I don't answer that question, then way down the line, I end up having bigger problems. Like the client is months behind on their payments, or they're not holding up their end of the deal in terms of completing their side of the assignment. So I'm always like waiting on them to make sure progress happens. This has showed up with, like again, with students or cello students and parents. I'd say goodbye to the parent and this child, and I'd close the door behind me and kind of go, gosh, what? There's something really weird about that lesson. And if I didn't answer that question, I wouldn't have discovered that or remembered that, oh wow, I was so focused on teaching the student that I was distracted from the fact that the parent was on their cell phone the entire lesson and not paying attention to anything. And I felt yucky because I recognized that the child knew that the parent wasn't engaged in the lesson like they should be, which is like a usual thing standard for my teaching. So if I didn't ask myself where the no was, like what is actually going wrong here, then ultimately that will stop further problems from happening in the future. And sometimes when you're finding your no, you're being prompted from a question where somebody has tread in the gray area, because your yes and your no is not always a black and white situation, right? So like, say for instance, one lesson where a parent was on their cell phone the entire time, that's okay, because life happens. Maybe they had an emergency at work or something like that. That was a gray area. But a definite no would be having that parent 6 weeks later on still on their cell phone the entire time. The conversation 6 weeks in is a lot more difficult than it is like just casually mentioning to the mom at the next lesson, hey, so let's put our phones away and be in this lesson today. That feels a lot more casual. It's definitely direct, but it's easier to address if you recognize that someone has walked into the gray area. So being sensitive to that is really important. So the first step is find your no. The second step is observe how the line was crossed. So in the case of like the parent on the cell phone, asking questions like, maybe they do have a work emergency, or in the case of a client who is perpetually late to everything, I need to ask myself questions like, are they actually forgetting? Do I need to put up automatic reminders? Is the street parking really awful? Is the traffic really unpredictable? Or do they just not really care about attending their lesson on time? So not knowing the ingredients for why or how the line was crossed, the boundary was crossed, it can make you feel like you are, you're just shoveling water out of a canoe and just kind of going, oh my gosh, I have no idea where this water is coming from. You don't know where to put your finger to stop the hole or to plug up the leak. So knowing where or how those ingredients and how the line was crossed really does help. So that's step 2. Step 3 is find your yes. So discovering or reminding yourself the way you want things to work out. That will really, really help, especially when you are announcing or having a difficult conversation about a boundary. It's really easier. Makes the conversation a lot easier to identify what you do want as opposed to what you don't want. And in the case of parenting, that is a good example of that is telling a toddler, hey, keep your food on your plate, that's a lot more effective in a toddler's brain because they are hearing the behavior that they should do as opposed to hearing the enforced behavior that they shouldn't do. Like, so saying, don't throw your food on the floor, that's not a great idea. A better solution would be to say, keep your food on your plate. So in the case of customer relationships or even, personal relationships, it's a lot better to say, hey, I really would love for you to arrive on time to our coffee date because I've got this thing coming up later on in the day. That's a lot better than saying, hey, could you not be so late? Okay, so step 3 is find your yes, find the way you want things to work out. Step 4 is deciding how you want to set the boundary. So I know from experience that not every time you don't need to have a difficult conversation every time a boundary is set. In fact, sometimes you don't have to even make it known that you have a boundary. And in the case of, I mentioned before, like a friendship where I have to avoid a certain topic with a certain person because it's not good for either of us. So I haven't told them outright, hey, I'm avoiding this topic of conversation because because saying that outright is not necessarily necessary for the relationship at that point. I can just myself hold the power of choice in conversation and guide that in a different direction. So if the conversation starts to go into that off limits topic, I can just change the subject to, you know what, I have a bok choy lasagna recipe that I really need to try that out. Even if it's completely off the wall, you can kind of just jump into a brand new topic and change the subject. And that works a lot, it works really well. And in the case of situations where you do actually need to state the boundary and that it was crossed and be a little bit more obvious about the boundary setting, you can do that in a fun way. You can do that by like making a joke or pointing a finger, like pointing a funny finger, kind of saying like, oh my gosh, today was the 6th time you were late. What's going on? Have that kind of tone of voice is a lot better than saying, hey, it was the 6th time you were late today. Are you, that's a lot more, serious tone. So deciding how you want to set the boundary is important. And it's worth doing, it really does help because you might take a step back and realize, you know what, I actually don't need to send this email. Or I actually shouldn't send this mass email because it comes across as passive aggressive or whatever. So then the 5th step is to take a deep breath because especially when you're like dealing with a really intense, difficult conversation, take a deep breath. Your brain really needs the oxygen to process all of this information. You are setting out to handle somebody's response. You are dealing with your own emotions. You're dealing with their emotions. You're dealing with the reality of your situation. It's a lot to take in, and your brain really does need the extra oxygen to process and deal with it in the best way possible. So take a deep breath. It really does help. Get yourself grounded and remind yourself of all of the previous steps mentioned before. So finding your no, finding your yes, how the boundary was crossed, and how you want to set it up in the future. Okay, so then the 6th step is set the boundary, which I know that sounds obvious, but it's kind of true. I have a marketing client who is working on a brand new project, and we were laughing via text the other day because she launched her brand new website that she'd been working on for forever. And it was just a click of a button, but it was like completely uneventful. Like, so sometimes setting the boundary can actually be just as uneventful. You're like stress about it. And then when you set the boundary, it's not as awful as you thought it was. Sometimes it is though. But you do actually have to do the thing eventually. So I also know that if it is a difficult boundary to set for you, and if it is a boundary that you have to set and enforce on a regular basis, it gets easier over time. The whole process gets easier over time because you are more skilled at handling someone's response to that boundary. Which brings me to the 7th step. The 7th step is acknowledging that their reaction is not you. It's not that's part of the boundary, right? So their reaction to the boundary is on the other side of that boundary. You are not responsible for their reaction. If you try to change the subject and they are just really dense about not taking the hint about changing the subject, their reaction is not your reaction. So you get to just hold that boundary and stand strong in that. Another instance of that is like if somebody has a really emotionally or a volatile emotional response to your boundary being set, then, their feelings might get hurt by the boundary. That's a possibility. You might lose a friend if you tell them that they're not allowed to come on vacation with you or what anymore. These are the realities of setting the boundary. So you have to bring a level of open-mindedness and non-attachment to this boundary setting. Okay, and then that brings me to the 8th or bonus step in setting difficult boundaries, which is self-care. And I know it's like at least in my circle, it feels like self-care is like a really obvious thing. It also is kind of over talked about. But I think sometimes we overlook the fact that the setting of the boundary itself is self-care. You, by stating and enforcing the fact that your clients have to pay you on time or ahead of time, or within a certain amount of time, you are caring for yourself. It might be like kind of the nitty gritty self-care. It's definitely not a mani-pedi, and it's definitely not a bubble bath, but it is self-care. Setting the boundary is self-care. Especially if you set the boundary in a really intentional and careful way. So, however, I will say, even though the boundary setting is self-care in and of itself, it's sometimes nice, especially if you know that the other party's reaction to the boundary is going to be a little bit on the crazy side. Scheduling time after that conversation to go have a solo hike or a bubble bath, or scheduling a time to go hang out with somebody who you really do love hanging out with, who it's an easy experience, maybe go watch a movie by yourself, any of those things. My personal favorite is to go on a really long drive and just roll down the windows, crank up some metal, and do like headbang scream session, or not even metal scream session, but just like really cheesy candy pop music. Katy Perry is a really great option for some post boundary setting music. So anyways, all that to say, those are the steps. You've got find your no. You find your no, you've observe how the line was crossed. That's 2. 3 is find your yes. 4 is decide how to set the boundary. 5 is take a deep breath. 6 is do the thing, set the boundary. 7 is recognizing that their reaction is not your reaction. And 8, or the bonus step, is participate in self-care in some way. Setting boundaries is really worth it. It's so worth it because you get to show up in the space that you have set forth, like you've set those boundaries. The space that you set up for yourself then can allow you to be confident, and it can allow you to be yourself in the world. And that's really, 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 really valuable. So that is my 8 steps or 7 steps and 8 with an 8 bonus step. Setting boundaries is important, and I really encourage you, if you try out these steps in this next week or two, shoot me an email, let me know what you thought. If you want, you can also share a moment in our Facebook group about how boundary setting went well or went poorly for you. We would love to hear all about that. So yeah, the Facebook community, again, is Barenaked Bravery. Just search in Facebook, Barenaked Bravery. And if you haven't downloaded it yet, I have a bravery bundle, which includes a worksheet with 12 questions that you can answer before you do something really scary and brave. So in the case of setting official boundaries with somebody, right before step 6, when you do the thing, it might be good to go through those 12 questions in that worksheet and make sure that you're feeling just a little bit better about the situation. So that is available by just going to barenakedbravery.com, and you can download the Bravery Bundle, which has 2 songs of mine, the Bravery boosting worksheet, and also the Barenaked Bravery coloring book. So you get a whole bunch of wonderful things when you sign up for that. I am so looking forward to Tuesday's episode with Nina Ferrara. She is a creative entrepreneur, and she is all about having a mindset of ease with her business. And I think that's sometimes a really brave choice when you are putting yourself out there. It's not a choice that I think we often it's not a common choice. Let's just say that. So, this is so great. I'm so glad again that you guys are here. I'm so grateful that you are listening, and I just wish you a really wonderful weekend. And please know that we really do need your vulnerability. We really do need your improvisation and your imagination, and we really need your barenaked bravery in our world, because the world really needs you to show up and speak up and stand up and set the boundaries and do the things.